Bollech-Fonseca, who will bring us the talk entitled Spiritualism in America. Remember, write down your questions, hand them to the volunteers. We will have the Q&A session right after Heather's lecture. Heather Bollech-Fonseca is an active participant in the dissemination of Spiritism. Through writing, speaking, and translating, Heather works to raise awareness among English speakers around the world about the existence and meaning of spiritual life according to the teachings of Spiritism. She's the author of the book, Changing Lives with Spiritism, Fresh Perspectives for a New Humanity, as well as co-founder of the Leon Denis Spiritist Group and co-founder and developer of the website explorespiritism.com. Born in upstate New York, Heather currently resides in South Florida, where professionally she works in project management. Let's welcome Heather.
Good afternoon. We're here today talking about the laboratory of the invisible world. And in this laboratory, results are not always predictable. Subjects have a will of their own. And yet somehow we are constantly learning about things that reveal natural laws. The tools of this lab are found in the human faculty of mediumship, an instrument that has allowed us to look beyond the curtain of the material world and bring back information, both from and about the inhabitants of the invisible spiritual realm, including the souls of those once living here on earth. In general terms, this awareness and practice denote the context in which people most commonly use the term spiritualism, which in turn typically refers to a movement that began following those landmark events involving the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York in 1848. The latter are seen as a catalyst for a craze that soon took the U.S. and Europe by storm. Previously seen as supernatural occurrences involving rare individuals, spirit manifestations became instead widespread and more broadly accessible, drawing the curiosity and participation of ordinary folk. Now, modern spiritualism did not emerge without preparation, for it had its relatively modern-day precursors, mediums and others who paved the way for this outbreak of communication between the two realms. Because the time had come for this invisible world to make itself known. And indeed, as documented by the volumes of spiritualist journals printed in the mid to late 1800s and early 1900s, spiritualism had become extremely popular as an attraction and a pastime. And evidence of life beyond the grave became a source of consolation for millions, as did other revelations and teachings brought by the spirits. The history of modern spiritualism is one that is so rich with fascinating records and details. But in the ever so brief time that I have with you today, we're actually going to take a very interesting but highly targeted look at this historical period. Spiritism has the events of that 19th century spiritualist activity at its starting point, going back to when the French scholar Allan Kardec first became witness to the communication with the spirits. Nevertheless, the information and teachings that he eventually went on to publish diverged in some aspects from the beliefs and practices of a great number of spiritualists in the United States and even in England to a large extent at this time. So with material from Kardec's Spiritist Review, we're actually going to look at his perspective on what was happening at this time here in the United States. And the first of these three articles, entitled The Exploitation of Spiritism, was published in the July 1861 edition. This was just 6 months after Kardec's launching of the Mediums book. Kardec opened this article by stating, "North America has claimed, and rightly so, the honor of being the first to reveal the manifestations from the beyond." However, he soon thereafter asked, why, among these people so far advanced in so many aspects, so worthy of our affinity, has the commercial instinct not been detained at the threshold of eternal life? And then he included excerpts from various ads taken from American spiritualist journals, claiming that these journals included announcements of such a kind on nearly every page. He pointed out that spiritualism in the United States indeed had become a booming business for individuals offering all kinds of mediumship-related services. Now keep in mind that at this time, the physical effects were still very common among spirit manifestations. So Kardec explained that because these effects excited curiosity more than they touched hearts, and because of the abundance of curious individuals throughout the country, then the opportunity for mediums of those effects to exploit that curiosity was greater, and it was more lucrative. And in seeing their faculty as a way to make a living, with the moral aspect remaining secondary or even null, then once embarked upon such a path, those mediums would find themselves having to maintain their reputation and satisfy their customers at any cost, including sometimes the fraudulent act of filling in for the spirits whose actions could never be guaranteed. And this is something that Kardec pointed out was much easier in the case of the physical effects than that of intelligent communications of a morally elevated reach. Well, Kardec emphasized, as we heard earlier today, that the best safeguard against trickery was found in the medium's upright character, honorability, and absolute lack of self-interest. And he went on to profess that while fraud is always condemnable, when tied to matters of a moral order, it then becomes sacrilege. And in the deception of good faith, hypocrisy. So Kardec said, if the false mediums did harm to no one but themselves, we'd have only a partial wrong. But what is most deplorable are the weapons that such actions place in the hands of detractors who seek to discredit the existence and the communicability of the spirits. And so here we have a clue about one factor that indeed influenced the eventual decline in the popularity of spiritualism, evidenced in part by the impact of the famous magician Harry Houdini and his efforts to expose so many fraudulent mediums in the early 1920s. Because obviously the more fraud you have taking place, and the more that people are turned off by the imposters, the more difficult it becomes to foster an environment in which meaningful learning and exchanges can take place. Now, just to be clear, Kardec affirmed that he did not deny the possession of the faculty among certain mediums who sold their services. But he reiterated his position that the attractiveness of financial gain is a temptation to fraud, and one that should always at least raise suspicion. In another Spiritist Review article, published almost 3 years later, May of 1864, Kardec set out to explain how and why the doctrine of the spirits varied between the new and the old continents. So reminding readers that it's not uncommon for a new idea to to arise in one country and then progress in another, Kardec presented his take on the positions of the United States and Europe in their respective roles regarding the emergence and the development of the Spirit's teachings. So first, Kardec described past events of Spirit manifestations, the ones occurring throughout all times, as something I mentioned before, one seen as supernatural occurrences involving rare individuals. But he pointed out that in contrast, the emergence of the events occurred in the United States on a scale that was large enough to grasp public attention on both sides of the Atlantic. Then he explains that the United States was a country that excelled in everything related to commerce, engineering, and mechanics, and was also one of great liberty, which fostered the eruption of those new ideas, reason for which it was the initial stage for the Spirit's teachings. So America became the birthplace of spiritualism and Spiritism. However, then Kardec claimed that America was more focused on the phenomena than the philosophy, so that with the satisfaction of that immense curiosity that was once awakened, people got tired. And the ideas here had little progressed from where they started. Now, Europe, on the other hand, Kardec argued, Europe excelled in the moral and philosophical sciences, offering elements more propitious for the development of the theory and the philosophy of the doctrine, which he said was then able to take great steps in spite of the obstacles, because it satisfied the aspirations of the masses. It filled an immense gap in their beliefs, and it satisfied what until then had no resolution. Just to interject here for a second, one might have the impression that the spiritualists in the United States were nothing but a bunch of people caught up in the latest fad. But if you really look into the movement during this time period, you'll find that there certainly were, perhaps among everything to the contrary, there certainly were a lot of people truly interested in studying the phenomena and in exploring the greater meaning and inspiration that they derived from the loftier of the communications that were being received. And we will look at this a little more in a little bit. But going back to this article from Kardec, he warned that to think America would remain behind would be to insult the intelligence of the people. And interestingly, he added, if the Americans reject the European theory because it comes from Europe, then they will accept it when it surfaces among them through the voice of the spirits, saying that this was only a matter of time. Now, was the issue with Europe, or could there be more to it? Well, the next thing Kardec affirmed was that what had found most opposition in America, and what was perhaps the only significant divergence, was the idea of reincarnation. Why? Well, there in America, he explained, the spirits had not been introducing this teaching. And you know what? In general terms, it seems this was the case. There is a very interesting text in a two-part submission to the Spiritual Scientist Journal of Boston in May of 1875, contributed by Emma Harding Britton, a British woman who lived for several years in the United States and was not only a medium herself, but also a renowned proponent of spiritualism in the United States. And she wrote to this journal to voice her strong opposition to what she considered to be a threat to spiritualism. So, for example, in her opening paragraph, she referred to reincarnation as one of the many obnoxious and repulsive side ideas ruthlessly engrafted upon the pure and fruitful soil of spiritualism. And later she stated, were I disposed to treat this subject from a ridiculous rather than a serious standpoint, I should find food enough for my purpose, even in the hazy attempts at a theory put forth by the best defender of the doctrine, Allan Kardec himself. As it is, I only desire to remove this fungus from the pure and wholesome soil upon which we as spiritualists have upreared our beautiful temple of faith, so fraught with hope in eternal progression, eternal love, individuality, and self-consciousness. So those are some pretty strong words. But in reading her article, we get a better idea of where she's coming from. Britain's most pressing objection stemmed from the fact that the spirits upon whose teachings the spiritualist movement, already 27 years in formation at that point, had been founded, they'd not been speaking to them of reincarnation, and in many cases had even denied its existence. And according to Britain, this was even more so the case in what she referred to as communications from tens of thousands of spirits during the earlier years of the Great American Outpouring. From some of her comments, it seems that this omission or negation was still largely, though not entirely, the case in the United States and in England at the time of her article. Now, meanwhile, from these spirits, the spiritualists had already derived tremendously comforting and inspiring revelations and teachings. And they justified their beliefs in those teachings with some of the very same arguments that Kardec himself had made in defending the existence of the spirits and the legitimacy of their communications. Well, firmly believing that Kardec, Anna Blackwell, Kardec's follower in England, and, quote, Kardec's few sympathizers in America had based their doctrine of reincarnation on mere theory, she argued that she and others were left entangled in the masses of contradictory theory. And they'd have to either discredit the mediums upon whom they'd been accustomed to rely upon as heavenly inspired messengers of truth, or question the worth of spirit communications as a source of information at all. At times I wondered to myself if she'd ever read any of Kardec's works, though I don't know if she read French, and from what I could tell, Anna Blackwell's translations came out only after her piece was published. But either way, considering her circumstances and recognizing her appreciation for the moral and inspirational value of the spiritualist teachings, I could actually sympathize with her apparent desperation to defend what she regarded as the truth. And when I read her question, is it not time that we begin to understand what spiritualism is not as well as what it is? I was reminded of the many times I have felt the same about Spiritism. And one cannot help but wonder why, just like those opposing spiritualists, why the spirits would introduce an idea like this in one place but not another. Well, according to Kardec in the United States, this had to do with a practice of caution on the part of the spiritual realm in light of the racial prejudices so deeply rooted in this country. And just to put things into perspective, Kardec's article was published almost exactly 1 year before the end of the Civil War. So Kardec said that after first establishing communication with the spirit world, the details of other matters would come with time. And he added that one of the results of the Civil War would be the gradual weakening of those racial prejudices that were truly an anomaly, he said, in such a liberal nation. Well, finding all these kinds of proclamations very intriguing, I decided to look for further information. And what I came across, in part, were documented details regarding strong ties of ideology and activism between spiritualists in the United States promoting freedom and individualism, advocates for the abolition of slavery in the U.S., and the proponents of our 19th century women's rights movement. Now, granted, among this was also evidence of opposition from spiritualists in the South and their protest against pro-abolition support that appeared in some of the spiritualist journals from the North. But in any case, supporting the ending of slavery and accepting that our souls live many earthly lives, ones that span a spectrum of time, places, gender, race, and other aspects of the human experience, those are two different things. And so, in the very least, Kardec's assertion gives us some interesting food for thought. Now, regarding Britain's philosophical objections, just an example, she commented on what she perceived in reincarnation as a loss of identity, individuality, and ties of kindred. And she also wrote that according to reincarnation, Earth's history is not made up of a long list of great and noble individuals, but instead the biographies of a few wandering spirits who keep stretching out their histories throughout all time and reproducing themselves under all manner of ever-changing form and circumstances. Now, because she had apparently no problem with the spiritualist teaching regarding a post-mortem progression of lives and experiences to be undergone in the spirit spheres for the attainment of purification and happiness, I think it will be quite interesting to know more about her concerns, the concerns behind her apparent repulsion to the idea of returning to the earth. After all, she called it a doctrine more loathsome, horrible, and repulsive even than annihilation itself. Still, Britain did make it clear that the chief concern at hand was the disparity of the teachings. And she was not alone in those arguments. So for those of us who now perhaps even take reincarnation almost as a given based on what we've studied, we should really be thankful to have not only the logic so eloquently and coherently laid out in Spiritism, but also the scientific, the circumstantial, even the mediumistic evidence that continues to surface in support of reincarnation. A third Spiritist Review article by Kardec addressing spiritualism in America was published in April of 1869. Indeed, a month after Kardec's own return to the spirit world. But this is one of those articles in that edition that we heard about earlier this morning that had already been sent to the press. And this piece echoes Kardec's statements from 5 years prior regarding reincarnation as the greatest barrier of separation between spiritualism in America and Spiritism in Europe. And in it, Kardec included an outline of 19 principles of spiritualism, reportedly approved by an assembly of spiritualist delegates from different parts of the United States. And then he compared them all with Spiritism, actually looking at what the Spirit's book had to say relative to each proposition. So he concluded, both points of view recognize the indefinite progress of the soul as the essential law of the future. Both admit the plurality of existences on more advanced worlds. And then he says the only difference is that Spiritism admits this plurality of existences first here on earth, until the spirit has acquired the degree of moral and intellectual progress that characterizes this world, after which it will leave for more advanced worlds where it will acquire new qualities and new knowledge. Adding to the same article, Kardec then includes passages from a report given at a spiritualist convention in Cleveland in 1867, as published in the New York Herald. And he did this to illustrate that the United States was lacking in a central point of coordination for tying together the convincingly just and elevated spiritualist ideas. So the embedded text includes some statements from this report that Kardec paraphrased as calling spiritualism a chaos where truth was incessantly mixed with gross error, and recommending more adequate methods of observation with a cautious mistrust of appearances. And most predominant was the call to end the practice of evoking spirits in the dark, as a way to inhibit impostors and to preserve the simple and the clear truths that were found in the manifestations and communications of a morally elevated reach. So what we have seen here, very briefly, in terms of this material taken from the Spiritist Review, gives us a little bit of insight into the developments of spiritualism in the United States during Kardec's time, at least from his perspective. Of course, we'd need much more opportunity to further explore these and other, even later developments. But at first glance, we might think that spiritualism is nowhere near as big today as it was during that time period. And of course, in terms of the widespread craze of curiosity and buzz surrounding contact with the spirits, there is truth to that. However, it is also quite evident that spiritualism has not gone away. And maybe it's been undergoing a sort of quiet transformation, or it's here in a different form. Today we do see a great and I believe even growing interest, or maybe resurfacing interest, in immortality, life after death, and communication with spirits. And even though fraud, inadvisable uses of mediumship, and commercial interests may still be present, it's at least my impression that a good number of today's self-proclaimed spiritualists do take interest in the meaning and the consequences of our spiritual existence, as well as in the comfort, the resolution, and the inspiration afforded by the efforts of our spiritual benefactors to reach out to those of us living here in the material world. Still, today's overall spiritualist movement, if you will, seems to comprise an array of relatively independent organizations and individuals, and the definition and scope of spiritualist beliefs and practices or studies still varies greatly depending on the source. For those of us who are spiritists, having studied from Kardec's works, where we find that breadth and depth of inspiring information so carefully organized, and in becoming exposed to the enlightening details found in other books now part of the Spiritist literature, it is admittedly kind of hard sometimes to contain our enthusiastic and our impatient will for everyone to benefit from these resources in the same way. And regarding reincarnation, it's also rather puzzling for us to imagine that someone could delve so deeply in contemplating our spiritual existence or our existence independent of matter without pondering some philosophical questions and the mounting evidence that, in our view, begs us to consider the possibility of reincarnation, even here on earth. But let us not be so arrogant or prideful of that which we believe based on what we've studied, and let's just see that we'd be better off to collaborate in the dissemination of that which we deem so valuable. We also need not be impatient or discouraged, but instead recognize that seeds have been and are being planted. we also should not be too prideful, and instead we should be humble enough to recognize that surely as Spiritists we too can benefit from things that spiritualists have to offer. Actually, I believe the greater calling here is for us to see the value of what spiritualism and spiritism both have in common, because both offer treasures of knowledge that humankind is so in need of, and not as mere philosophical wisdom or some optimistic, wishful ideology. Thanks to the work being carried out by collaborators in 2 dimensions of life in the laboratories of the invisible world, we have the necessary evidence for these fundamental principles. And so on that note, I would like to end with some words from the Spirit Emmanuel, as found in the preface to André Luis's book, No Solar, where he says, "It is not enough for individuals to cling to their human existence. It is necessary to know how to profit from such an existence with dignity. The steps of a Christian, whatever his or her religious school may be, should move surely toward Christ. And in our doctrinal area, we need both Spiritism and Spiritualism, but most of all, spirituality." Thank you so much, and God bless.